All right, that was your 60-second warning. We have the time is passed. Let's get started. Welcome back, everybody, especially to folks that have been here before. Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here today with our 8th episode now of When Things Go Wrong. For those who don't know me, I'm David Vaillencourt, the founder and CEO of the GMP Collective. I wear many hats in this industry. I'm proud to be the vice chair of Committee D37, ASTM International Committee D37, developing consensus standards, cannabis standards, work and advise many companies, both in industry, ancillary service providers, and nonprofits to ensure that we've got safe, quality, and consistent cannabis to facilitate global trade. And this is a major industry that we are working towards the same mission on, and I am so stoked to be here using When Things Go Wrong's webinar as just another tool to provide value and help align the industry with best practices before any mistakes happen, which that's life. Mistakes certainly happen, but let's mitigate them together, shall we? We have a really great discussion plan today, but before I jump in and introduce our guests, I want to go through some housekeeping, which I'm already seeing a Q&A. So I think we are already, thank you for using the Q&A. Just a quick note on that. Yeah, it looks like double check your audio. Thanks, Emily, for getting an answer in there. So for some housekeeping, use the Q&A feature, ask questions. That's what we're here for. We're here for you guys. It's not just for Jack or Emily or I to yak about all the things we know about. It's to make sure that we are speaking to things that you want to have answers to. We've got 1 hour. Now we're down to 56 minutes. So we're going to use that full hour and be mindful of everybody's time. Here, we're really going to dive into problems that we've seen throughout our days, both in the cannabis industry and drawing on things from outside of the cannabis industry that are parallels and that we can use to learn, to get in with the ultimate goal of giving you all tangible solutions that you can take and use today, if not today, tomorrow, in your operation, no matter what stage you're at, whether you're planning to start a cannabis cultivation facility, you're in the business plan development, you're in licensing, design to I'm already operating and I have opportunities for improvement in front of me. As a reminder as well, this, as all our episodes will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you have a colleague or a friend that missed out that you think would benefit from seeing this event, be sure to take our follow-up email and forward it their way. But of course, the best part of being here live is back to where I started. The Q&A feature. You've got questions, we've got answers. Between me and the 2 individuals in our hot seat today, put them on the spot. Ask the questions that you want to hear discussed. And with that, I want to dive into what we're here to talk about. Cannabis facility risks, OSHA, and more, right? We've got some things to discuss, from sensitivities to cannabis, talking about any negative reaction to interacting with the cannabis plant or throughout your cannabis production process. There's been multiple reports that have been validated, that have been confirmed over time of people developing sensitivities, rashes, allergies, and that has led to injuries. Nobody wants to see that. That can happen in any industry, but we're now just starting to see it, discuss it, and actually talk about it. So let's understand what that real problem is. That relates to indoor air quality, dust, solvents, and more. We are commercial industrial manufacturing, right? We have issues around indoor air quality, a lot of things that we have not thought about before, but really need to be at the forefront. And I bet Emily and both Jack would argue we have thought about it before, just people aren't addressing it until it's becoming a problem. And at that point, it's too late. So let's get ahead of it. And that ties into the other important theme and point here of the cost and impact of these problems. There's a laundry list of reports. I even remember 2 years ago, first researching the OSHA library, where you can run a report on OSHA's database and see the fines and letters that have been sent to companies. And there are plenty in the cannabis industry that have been fined. There's penalties, there's workman's comp premiums, and then of course, just a plain bad reputation, which I don't want anybody to see in our industry, because remember, if it impacts one company, it actually impacts us all as an industry. It puts a negative stigma on us, and we've got enough battles in front of us. So let's do the right thing and mitigate those risks. And so if it's not already clear, Why is this important, right? We're here to help us all together, us as the industry. And that starts with you and being in attendance, being able to understand, some of the major claims and fines related to worker safety in the cannabis industry. Discussing and talking about the hierarchy of controls when evaluating operational hazards and worker exposures. And we're going to take a few minutes to be sure to talk about some of the top overlooked mitigation strategies that can and should be deployed to prevent major brand exposures. And with that, I'd love to bring Emily and Jack on stage. I'm super glad to have you guys here. I don't know who wants to go first. Why don't we, Jack, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, David. And appreciate you bringing me in and being a part of this. It's great to work with Emily. We've both been involved in a sustainability working group out in Colorado over the past couple of years. So it's nice to share some insights here today. Just for everybody's background on me, I come from 40 years in the environmental risk management industry. I won't go through the whole history of what I've done, but it's been with private industry, it's been in consulting firms across a number of industries, from healthcare to real estate to, you name it, water utilities, chemical manufacturing, pharmaceutical. So, and then the last 14 years of my corporate career was doing environmental insurance placements as a broker and risk advisor to major corporations. And the interesting parallels that I'll fill you in on that kind of drew me into to cannabis are that when I first entered the environmental field, it was probably 10 or 11 years old. New regulations, a lot of uncertainty over how to implement them, what they meant, finding out a lot of unintended consequences of those regulations that people didn't anticipate, and trying to figure out new ways to solve these problems and new emerging issues. Kind of jumped to the end of my career when I got into insurance and risk management. Same thing, environmental liability insurance was very young at that point. And there's a lot of education, both of the insurance underwriters and corporate risk managers, on what their environmental risks were. So I started craving, again, more of that emerging issue, looking for innovative and novel ways to solve new problems. And that ultimately led to cannabis and getting to work with Emily, and then getting to meet David. And now I'm also participating in the ASTM D37 Cannabis Committee on their sustainability and DEI subcommittees.
Awesome, Jack. It's so nice to have you here. It was great to get to connect with you. I guess we met in person in New Jersey back in the fall, but then back in San Antonio in January as well.
Conference, yeah.
Yep. We'll dive a lot deeper into some of the things you just touched on, Jack, both from your nearly 4 decades of experience. I'm having trouble believing that you're that old enough to have 4 decades of experience. That's okay. It's amazing to have you here, and we'll draw on some parallels.
It's all a lie.
No. Emily, I've gotten to work with you a bit, I guess mostly in the NCIA forum, where we've overlapped on some committees there. Welcome. You're just up the road from me here in the Denver metro area. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi, yeah, thank you, David. I'm grateful to be here, be a part of this monthly webinar series that David has been going on. I've been also a participant on these webinar series, and I find them very fruitful and insightful with information. So thank you for putting them on, and I appreciate being a part of this one, especially with Jack. I know he mentioned we work on the Colorado, it's not Colorado restrictive, but it is Colorado centric, or at least it originated in Colorado, the Sustainability Working Group. We have expanded since to include, people from all over, but that's how I know Jack, and I've been working with him for several years there, with David, with NCIA, as he mentioned. So thanks to both of you for allowing me to be here and be a part of this discussion. It is very important. My background is in environmental sustainability and policy. I have a master's degree and an additional graduate certificate. Couldn't get enough school, apparently. And I landed in cannabis pretty honestly very happenstance. I applied for a job of, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, feels like definitely at least a decade ago. And it ended up being in an ancillary business that supplied cannabis with filtration media for extraction. And that's kind of how I got in. And I love it. And my firm, the company I work for now, Byers Scientific, I am their senior project manager. We work in several industries, which is nice, but I do focus a lot of my work as senior project manager with the cannabis industry, and continuing to grow my network and work with clients and really troubleshoot with people, with clients who really are our partners. And I enjoy that. I enjoy that part of my work a lot, and helping us achieve, environmental compliance and more responsible decisions and around worker health and environmental health and safety as well. So glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I think, there's two things of many that we all have in common here. And it's, I'd say, being a lifelong learner, whether it's advanced degrees and additional certificates, and even Jack, all of us. I mean, nobody here comes from the cannabis industry. We weren't born into the cannabis industry. It hasn't existed, at least in the legal, framework that we see today, long enough. But drawing on our experience from other industries and knowledge from education and applying that, there are so many parallels and opportunities for us to learn together. And I'm so glad to see the merging of our minds here to the greater good of the industry. And so before I go into the first question that I have for you, Emily, which builds off of what you were just saying with troubleshooting and, doing environmental impact assessments and helping folks get ahead of the curve in your day-to-day, just setting the stage right and reinforcing that this is a problem, right? This is not just a nebulous idea. I think it's really easy to think about, trying to be proactive and, well, that's great, but what's the probability the problem is really going to happen? Prove it, I'll cross that bridge when it's a problem. And, especially for investors, if you're thinking about talking to the C-suite, raising capital, running your business profitably, you've got your CapEx and your OpEx solution, considerations, right? And it's, do I pay for it? Pay me now or pay me later? And you take, hopefully make the decision to work with Emily's company and invest on the CapEx side to build it into the design to ensure that your OpEx, not just your day-to-day costs, but the fines, the cost of not doing the right thing, of damage control, of having to fix mistakes, that is so expensive and costly. And it leads to issues that are here. These are just, 4 examples of, of press in the last, less than a year of, the environmental odor, the skunky cannabis. We're able to really define and identify the molecules, the aromatic compounds that are creating those odors. And, is there a worker hazard there? That's one side. And then of course there's the nuisance, side that we're all familiar with, or most of us are familiar with, but that's important. You need to think about that ahead of time, or it's going to be a long-term, thorn in your side. There's, without naming names, I think we are all familiar with this article at this point, the cannabis worker's death, triggering closer OSHA industry scrutiny. Back to what I said earlier, it's not the first time that OSHA has shown up at a cannabis facility, has fined a cannabis facility. We'll dive into that a little bit more later as well. And, showing just a positive light too. Again, we're not all here about the doom and gloom problems, but a lot of folks didn't know, I didn't even know this until recently. There's a federal agency that is actually creating cannabis worker safety plans for free. So we're not living in silos. Even if you don't call Jack, myself, or Emily, there are free resources. And if you get nothing out of today, it's knowing that you do have resources. You don't have to go it alone. You can get that. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and bring it back to our attention. Emily, let me start with you. I mean, you just talked about how you're troubleshooting with clients every day. You're a project manager, and I've done enough project management in my life to know that, one, it's not my favorite skill. So thank you. I appreciate project managers keeping the potatoes and balls in the air and in the right, in the right hands and getting things done. That's super critical. But more importantly, that means you get involved in a lot of projects. You've probably seen a lot across the industry. So from pre-construction to live operations, I don't know, maybe the top 2, top 3, is there a common theme of mistakes that you've seen that folks are, forgetting to do, that are harming workers without them even realizing it?
Yes. So let me think about the top 2 or 3. I would say the main one that we see is a lack of proper ventilation in indoor commercial cannabis operations. And kind of coinciding with that is a lack of properly engineered controls. And so, it's a growing industry at the scale at which we see commercial cannabis now. These issues they were still kind of issues, but it affected a smaller group of people. Now it's like big industry and it's becoming very commercialized. These operations are growing in footprint significantly. And so now it is more of something that needs to be, even more paid attention to. And so the MEPs, the mechanical designers, the architects that are building these facilities, they have their HVAC experts, they have their HEPA filters, their carbon filter manufacturers that, are traditionally that they work with in the commercial industries that they work with, right? But they're coming into cannabis and just kind of taking that same model and applying it to cannabis, and that's the problem. Unfortunately, the concentration levels of not only trim dust, but the monoterpenes, the volatile organic compounds, which terpenes are, that are the concentration levels in these indoor environments, all of these contribute to very poor air quality, not only for worker health, but also the plants, because you're talking pathogens, mold spores, et cetera, that can obviously be very detrimental to your canopy. And so I would say that that's the main issue I see. And then second to that is lack of or reliance on, I should say, PPE, and lack of, quite frankly, from what I've seen. Either they're just not even wearing personal protective equipment, the workers that are, trimming all day long, or harvesting, and when you agitate these plants, they give off a lot of compounds. And again, like we sample, we know the levels that we're looking at, and they're not, I'll get into it later, but they're problematic for health, to breathe in over long periods of time. So yes, they're either not wearing any PPE or they're relying on it fully and like, oh, I'll wear a respiratory mask and we'll call it good. And that is a second line of defense. That should never be your first line of defense for protecting your workers. No other industry relies only on PPE. That is kind of absurd. So that's probably the top two. Yeah.
Well, wow. Yeah. And I guess to recap what you just said, because if I were to summarize it succinctly, it's not a simple problem, right? And, going back to the architects and the MEPs, it really relies on the owners and the experts, the operators, to ask the questions and to think about. You just named, I think I wrote down 3 topics. One that you need to consider. One, the dust and particulate. The size of that is a risk, that is a hazard in itself. And so how that requires certain engineering controls, filtration, how the airflow is happening, and in what areas that dust exists. You've got, perhaps relatedly, to the cannabis plant and the processes, the mold spores, microbial, in the air. What's that risk, right? That requires a separate control and consideration than just the dust and the particulates. And then you've got the aromatic compounds, the VOCs, whether it's terpenes or solvents, et cetera. And that again is a different risk, different set of hazards, and a different mitigation and control strategy. So you have to, if you think of it as ask those 3 questions: where are those risks? Do I have those risks in my facility? Where are they? How do I measure them? How big are they? And then how do I control them? You got to do that in the design phase. You got to work with your architects and MEP, and not just, it requires some work.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the other side of the PPE, and relying on PPE as a failed model, as a first line of defense, and then actually even just knowing to have the PPE in the first place when you need to have it. We've got a lot there. Jack, I want to kind of go over to you then, and see what your parallels are there. This all ties into risk management, right? And you've worked, especially working in the environmental industry for decades. Whether it's, I had experience, I worked in the oil spill assessment, Deepwater Horizon, with a lot of friends being from a geology background, working on environmental remediation, Superfund sites. Draw me some parallels there. Tell me about how this applies to risk management, and any parallels from your environmental days.
Yeah, there's so much that, all this ties in together, and there's so many drivers behind it. As a risk manager and as an organization, National Cannabis Risk Prevention Services, we want to help prevent things happening before they go wrong, right? And be prepared to deal with those afterwards. So it really starts with assessing, and what we see is people are relying on their application to understand how to run their business, and they're not really aware of all the potential hazards that can be present in their operation. So, and I think that it stems from a lot of different things. There's new business owners, that are jumping into the industry. They're not that familiar with what it takes to start and operate a business. And you have the legacy market, and there's a number of them that are really thirsty to learn how to now move into a regulated market. But they came from operating when risk management was don't get caught, and now we have a lot of people that are now getting into the legal cannabis business, and it's all about disclosure, transparency, reporting, documentation, and so there's this disconnect that we're working to fill, and our goal is to raise the whole industry, help the industry get better. We want it to reach normalization quickly, and we want to have fun doing it. And it really takes business controls. You mentioned your work on oil spill response. I started in the oil industry as well. The second month of working there, I was like, another safety meeting? And somebody said, yeah, we have them every month. And so I've worked in highly regulated industries and in industries where there are dangers, and there are regular safety meetings, regular communications around safety. And so that we're not there yet, and we're starting to build that. I think we're reaching a turning point in the industry with a lot of things that have happened over the last year or two. A lot of things have gone bad, and I think people are starting to realize they need to get better control over their business. And so some of the things we're talking about here is just not having proper controls to assess hazards, to identify what the risks are and develop plans. You mentioned NIOSH being able, doing free plans. They also have if anybody goes on the NIOSH site to look for that offering, look for their hierarchy of controls for worker health and safety. PPE is at the bottom. There's a whole number of steps, and they lay them out in terms of controlling exposure to hazards that should be in the SOPs that we're talking about. We're talking about all these SOPs for different aspects of the business, and you want to go through each of those operations and identify what the potential hazards are. And it doesn't have to be a hazardous chemical. It can be something like cannabis dust that ends up being part of a creation of a hazardous environment that can affect people. And of course, all this also does tie in, like Emily said, to product quality too. And so, worker health and safety, product quality, particularly on the microbial and I was going to say virus or viroid, we're seeing a whole new issue quickly emerging in the industry. That all takes assessment of the whole entirety of an operation, from materials coming into a building to when they leave, and every step of the way. So it involves really working across departments. There you go. Thank you for putting that up there. It really takes teams working across departments to solve these problems, because they may look like they're happening in isolation, but they're really very interconnected with a lot of things that are going on.
Yep. I agree, and I put this on the screen because you brought it up, Jack, and I think it's really important. Back to PPE being the last line of defense, and where those hierarchy controls, and how it ties back to this is not just use PPP as a last line of defense because we said so, but it goes back to what's the most effective, right? If you can eliminate a risk, well, then you have no problem, right? You've got a slippery floor or an icy sidewalk as I look outside and it's snowing, and you make the ice go away, you don't have a slippery floor. Versus let's put on yak tracks or micro spikes as the ice analogy and use that. That's still not foolproof. Best to eliminate and then follow from there. And I think that's a really important point. Which
in many cases, or at least you hear of many cases, and we see some as well, where they're just relying on PPE. They're making PPE available. They're not even doing that properly, because I don't think they're generally, if they're relying on PPE, they're probably not doing all the fit testing for respirators or all the appropriate, matching the PPE for the hazard. And this is all preventable. We don't need something to go wrong to fix this. We can be fixing this because, we're strong believers. Nobody should, get injured seriously on the job or worse.
Yep. Well said. Emily, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Because if you do, I want you to jump in. Otherwise, I want to ask Jack another question on something you said earlier. I think you're good. Okay. So Jack, you brought up something that we didn't talk about asking, but I think it's important to get your perspectives on. So from my background, pre-cannabis, being in environmental damage assessments and lab testing for legally defensible data, that's what was knocked into my brain after grad school. And when we're working on Superfund sites, we're getting data on exposure levels. That needs to be legally defensible. And so I bring that up in the context of disclosure and transparency and
documentation.
What's that?
And documentation.
And documentation, yes. So share your thoughts on that in the context of what I see so often with folks is, well, it's VOCs aren't a problem, or we don't have a dust problem. And I say, prove it. How can you prove it? Have you actually done any particulate tests? Have you left settle plates out? Have you done any, employee exposures where they're actually wearing, I forget what they're exactly called right now, but where they're wearing it to gather what are the VOC exposures? Is that an excuse that you can use and say, I don't have a problem, but I don't have the data to back it up?
Well, I think you can get away with it as long as nothing happens, right? I mean, nobody's going to ask. OSHA's not generally coming out to facilities, although that could all change at some point. I think just on that topic, I think you're going to see states building up their enforcement arms. I think you're going to, it's happening in spots, and it's going to continue to happen as the industry matures.
Mm-hmm.
But documentation again is key, both for the preventive side of things. Complete documentation in your SOPs, so that a new employee can basically pick up an SOP and understand what to do. It has to be written very specifically. It should have kind of the requirement or the hazard, what the process is to control that, going through that hierarchy, how to manage that exposure, and then some resources that they can always turn to. And those standards should always be updated. And when they're updated, they should also be documented as to when they were updated and what change was made. And we don't see that too often, that people actually have a change protocol for their SOPs. Because at the end of the day, if you're in front of OSHA because something serious happened to a worker, or you're in front of a judge because you've got a claim against you for wrongful injury, wrongful death, whatever, you're in front of the Department of Justice because they're alleging some other activity. You have to document. If you show up and you have no documentation, then nothing happened. You can't claim that you had certain things in place, they took certain precautions, if it's not documented. Because at the end of the day, when something goes horribly wrong and you're facing somebody who is going to make a decision about your business, if you have nothing to show, you're out of luck. And you and I know that from the work we've been involved in, and those, if cannabis companies want to become world-class operations, that's what world-class operations do. They have very strict procedures, they have complete procedures, they have it all documented. People understand how risk management fits into their job, because it's a discipline that gets embedded and instilled in the business. It's not the job of one risk manager to kind of do this. It's really something that is instilled across the operations to control all aspects of the business. And to me, risk management is about protecting people, period.
Yeah.
Sometimes the protection is for the investors and the owner. Sometimes it's for the workers. Sometimes it's for the consumer. Sometimes it's for the community. We do have community members out there that don't want our businesses in their neighborhood. So you have to have, and I think that's actually how diversity and equity and inclusion actually weaves in beyond just headcount. It's when you start diversely looking at who are the people I need to protect. And there might be, in some cases, hierarchies of who's more important in a particular case for a certain thing, the investors and the owners, versus another situation where you have hazard analysis, the workers. So I think all of that needs to come together. Everything has to be holistic and it all has to be documented if we're going to be what I think we can be, an example to other industries, because we cut across so many different industries, to be an example of how to run safe indoor agricultural operations. That's going to be needed for the broader scheme of sustainability. And we could develop techniques that are applicable to growing tomatoes and other plants indoors as we go forward. And I want to help us take advantage of that opportunity.
Well, and Jack, I like where you're going. I want to just emphasize a point you made. The word world class, right? And it, to some people, that almost seems juxtaposed to, in my world with GMPs, good manufacturing practices, folks will call it get more paperwork. And it's like, oh my God, more paperwork, documentation. But you just made it very clear, and I don't think anybody would argue with that. When you look at world-class companies, whether it's Fortune 500, profitable companies across the manufacturing supply chain in the world, they have good documentation. You can't have a world-class operation without good documentation, a culture of quality, a culture that's committed to safety and transparency. And it all goes back to that documentation, which I want to acknowledge. And I think we all agree here that when you go back to the legacy marketplace and where you don't document things, you don't share information, that is a culture to overcome, to say, just to take that step and say, I'm going to document a deviation. I'm going to admit on paper that we made a mistake. That's going to get me in trouble. That's what gets you in trouble. No, that's actually what keeps you out of trouble. It allows you to, in two ways. One, when OSHA shows up, or your state regulator, you can say, this is not the first time we're working on the problem. I've identified it and I'm working on a solution instead of trying to cover it up. That actually goes a long way when you think of it from that end.
And that's actually the risk management process, right? Yeah. It's coming up with a plan, which starts out with assessing and evaluating options and coming together with a plan. You implement that, but then you monitor and modify that. It feeds on itself and creates a continuous improvement process, and that can be applied to really anything.
Yep. So that I want to go to you, Emily, and then we're getting some really great questions that I'll try to weave in here. So with all this said, what are best practices in the industry? Are there established guidelines? I mean, I know you've mentioned you and Jack working on the sustainability working group, and obviously you guys have a lot of engineering control solutions that you provide to clients, but you think about what we talked about earlier with the VOCs, the dust, what is an acceptable limit? How do I even know where to benchmark? So yeah, share what you've got for us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're talking about a couple different areas of, I guess, sources of air quality issues, right? We're talking trim dust, we're talking, particulate matter, which there are very well-established thresholds that are problematic for human health. I think that was actually one of the questions for PM 2.5. These are existing thresholds that are out there. And then you have mold, which pathogens and mold spores are carried by the dust. So that just makes it even more problematic. They have to kind of have those carriers to move throughout the air. And then you have the VOCs, which I think is often an overlooked, and VOCs contribute to the odor. Yes. There's a specific compound that's a thiol, not a terpene, that is in fact, the culprit of the odor smell. which our scientists actually helped discover. But really, what's nice about mitigation or best practice for VOCs is you'll be able to capture the thiols as well as the terpenes. But interestingly, terpenes are being looked at, specifically monoterpenes. There are sesquiterpenes, there are different types of terpenes, right, that come off of the cannabis plant. Monoterpenes are being studied. We keep talking about NIOSH. They're actually doing, like, I think it's a 3 to 5 year study that is commencing soon. And they're not just focusing on cannabis, but they are looking at cannabis operations, and they're looking at worker health exposure, and kind of doing a worker health exposure assessment for monoterpene specifically. And there are, again, there's no cannabis specific, regulation out there. But they're using turpentine, for example, which is quite interesting. Turpentine has 5 of the terpenes that are also commonly found in cannabis in turpentine, and turpentine has exposure limits that have been set, and it's 100 ppm. 100 ppm. And I know from our sampling at Byers emissions analysis that the concentration levels are far above that in these commercial cannabis operations. Not only that, but they're recirculating air to try to maintain environmental controls, and they're not bringing in any fresh air makeup, which is also a problem for worker health. All of this can be remedied through just having proper air purification and engineered controls. And I think, so best practice, best practice really comes down to making sure that the technology, the air purification or indoor air quality technology that you decide to vet, and I say that with emphasis, you have to vet these technologies in a cannabis environment. You need to make sure that they are third-party tested in a cannabis environment. There's been several articles that have come out for manufacturers of these, technologies that have been around: photocatalytic oxidation, bipolar ionization, you name it. They've been around for decades and decades. They do very well in certain settings: industrial, commercial, residential, etc. UV is another one. But when you put them in a cannabis environment with the high levels of VOCs and the humidity levels, it can cause interactions with the way the technologies work, and in fact create byproducts. And we've actually studied one of these ourselves in-house as we were kind of looking at vetting air purification technologies. My company, the scientists, were like, we should make sure that this doesn't produce anything bad in these environments, because humidity specifically does have a huge impact on how these systems work. And we in fact did see several of the aldehydes that went into the system, they were doubled on the exhaust in cannabis. And I'm not bashing any manufacturer, because it doesn't matter. My point is, when it comes to best management practice, you have to make sure that these are tested, and it's not just hearsay. I mean, referrals are great, but really do your due diligence as operators and look into making sure it's third-party tested in a cannabis environment. And ask that question, because I can almost guarantee you that even the large manufacturers, it's not been. And so you just have to be very careful, because you could be contributing to even more powerful, carcinogens are very detrimental to worker health. So as you're trying to go in there and help purify the air, protect your plants, protect your workers, you're actually causing, formation of ozone in your facility, and it's a no. So yeah, definitely vet the technology. I know we offer electrostatic precipitation and filtration, and I'm not going to get all nerdy about it, but that has been tested and proven and safe for cannabis environments, high humidity environments, because it is completely enclosed. And then the way that, there's a collector plate and then an additional carbon filter, just to, like, insurance policy, make sure that there's nothing byproduct wise exiting the system. And so that is what we offer. That is what technology, as a manufacturing company, we decided, we vetted and we tested, and that's what we bring to bear in the cannabis industry, confidently. And then when it comes to odor control, VOC control, best management practices, of course, carbon. Everyone kind of knows that. What people don't realize is that not all carbon is created equal. You have to look at the source of the carbon. Charcoal, pelletized charcoal, not ideal for VOCs, for cannabis emissions. You want I'm not, again, like, I don't want to give it away too much, but you want specific carbon, you want it to be a specific material, you want your surface area to be right for the concentration levels that you're picking up. Otherwise, you're going to have spent carbon in a matter of like a day at some of these facilities, especially if you're harvesting. So you need the proper carbon, you need the proper housing for the carbon, you need the proper face velocity and residence time, moving the air through the system, through the carbon to make sure it is adsorbed properly. And then not to mention, you need to have pre-filters to make sure you're capturing the humidity, the moisture, because that will actually degrade your carbon very fast as well. So there's these different kind of levels of engineering of carbon scrubbing that I think is often overlooked. And everyone's like, oh, we're just going to slap in a couple carbon filters from this X manufacturer that everybody knows. It's in line and we're going to call it good. And that, unfortunately, you just Google odor complaints, cannabis odor complaints. We're not talking like someone smoking a joint down the street. This is like major complaints coming from neighborhoods near commercial growers, commercial manufacturers. It's a problem, and it's often a problem after the fact because they didn't have the proper mitigation in the design phase. And now they're having major, brand exposure that is negative. And that is very hard to come back from. On another note, regulators are getting smarter. So, and it may not be a compliance driven issue at first to meet, a lot of these host facilities, or host towns, municipalities that are very like 420 friendly, they want cannabis business in their town. That's great. I love seeing that. And so they often don't want to put too much red tape, but they're getting smarter in the sense that their stakeholders are also the residents. And if the residents are not happy and they're complaining every day, picking up the phone, that's going to have to be a problem for the commissioners, the zoning commissioners, and the regulatory bodies. And so they're going back and making more stringent regulations about the nuisance odor controls and requirements. And so when it comes time to re-up your license, and we've seen this, we've actually had to be expert witness testimony to the upgrade and controls in several cases in order for them to get their license renewed. And again, like, we want clients to be successful, so we're happy to do that. But the point is the regulators are getting smarter. So just because in your town they may not focus too much on it now, they're like, just control it. Just don't have any smell. It's just not that simple. It will get more detailed as they get smarter.
Wow. That I really enjoyed everything you just mentioned there, Emily. I mean, on the most recent topic of, working with your local officials and not just, oh, great, no ordinances or light ordinance or vague. Great, this will be easy for me. It's like, no, it's going to blow up for you later. And it reminds me of one of our good colleagues who's been on our show before, Brian Anderson with Anderson Porter Design, of their series of Cannabis is a Good Neighbor. But that requires being a good neighbor and, building trust. And, another thing that I just can't emphasize enough every chance I get to, work early and often with your stakeholders. And that includes especially, the regulators, your city zoning, ordinance, fire marshal, building that relationship and trust and showing them that, yeah, you're not just slapping a carbon filter in, that you've thought through everything you just described. You've qualified your vendors that are going to provide you this equipment. You understand how it works. You just dove into a bunch of different considerations. The point is, right, for anybody who's not an expert, you need to call an Emily. You need to call an expert on whatever topic it is, from odor to, extraction to permissible exposure limits for, solvents, flammability limits, OSHA, industrial hygiene. There are so many different topics. You need to have an expert. It's not just the one size fits all. I know a guy, or, my architect can do everything. It's not that simple. And then the maintenance afterwards, right? Just because you put it in, it operates great. All cars are great, and they drive off the lot new, but if you don't change the oil, don't rotate the tires, 3 years, 36,000 miles later, you've got, a non-functional, non-reliable vehicle on your plate, on your hands, if you're not doing the maintenance. So changing the filters, understanding the frequency, and not forgetting about that stuff when you go from, commissioning to operation. You need to think through and document. Oh, wait, back to documentation. Another common theme that keeps coming up, I think is really important to address. I want to, I don't know, Jack, if you have anything to add there before I go into a couple of questions here that we got.
Real quick. I mean, that's a great example. When I first, there's a facility not far from where I live that's had odor complaints. And when I heard they were just using carbon carbon filtration and fans, made me a little skeptical that that's going to be enough. And then I talked to Emily about this, and she said they had isolated the chemical. And that's what we did when I did my early days in wastewater treatment. You had to identify what was in the water and how to treat that. You didn't just throw a filter at it, right? So, and that becomes the best practice, right, at some point. And then, your question was about best practices and who establishes those. Well, they come from all different people. They come from people like us, but they come from other states. You might be in one state, but you probably should be looking at what's going on in what might be the most advanced state, in your opinion, for a particular regulation, because at some point your state's going to catch up with their state, or at some point this is going to be federally legal and everything's going to be even, and they're going to pick the most stringent of the stringent, right? So you need to be looking there. It comes from ASTM and organizations like that are creating standards. It comes from other industries where we've been in regulated industries, and the practices that are applicable to these types of operations. It comes from the operators of these businesses when they talk to vendors and they identify the problem, and then the vendors go off and figure out a solution. Now that starts to become the best practice. So it's an organic kind of evolution. And there's also something to watch out for that I call the best management or best practice trap, which is it's not stagnant. There's always going to be a better practice at some point. So you can't get complacent that you've got the best practice in place and you're done. It's constantly evolving. And that's the beauty of doing like an assessment that looks at what you have today versus best practices. So you can know what the gap is and know what the gap is in particular areas, in your health and safety program, in your inventory control program, whatever it might be.
Reminds me of a common phrase that I'm sure we all cringe when you hear, well, that's the way it's always been done, right? Like, no, hold on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And getting off topic again, but I mean, a little bit, it is a worker health and safety issue, but that's the way it's always been done. One of the other emerging risks that we're seeing is ergonomics. And there's one of the big reasons for this is it used to be seasonal. It used to be seasonal and workers didn't speak up about anything, right? Mm-hmm. Now you're in a regulated environment. Workers should be speaking up. They have a voice and they should know that they have a voice. And that work isn't seasonal anymore. Now you're trimming like constantly. And
every 2 weeks.
It's going to lead to ergonomic issues, which is going to translate to injuries, which is going to translate to workers' comp insurance, which is going to translate to employee retention. It's all going to trickle into all of those things. There's a cascade effect by not paying attention to the stuff.
I think that's actually a really good point. I know we didn't bring that up as a topic to discuss, but back to OSHA and worker safety and insurance premiums. I mean, I remember hearing a fact at one point of how barbers have really high insurance premiums because of the ergonomic issues, because they're just manually cutting that rheumatoid arthritis. How many hair barbers?
Great comparison.
Yep. And so we need to think about that, which goes back to just brainstorming, right? If you don't know where to begin, start with a Google search, sit down with your team, look at every process in your operation, right? And be like, what are the risks? Let's look around, let's look internally, talk to your workers. What are they seeing? I was
just going to say, listen to your workers. The more they're encouraged to speak up and bubble up these issues, they're the ones that are going to start recognizing this first.
Yep. They're your best line of defense, right? They're your best asset and line of defense. They live it 8 hours a day, sometimes more, 40 hours a week, and
they could become your worst enemy. Yeah. Employers will like to say disgruntled employees are causing trouble, right? Well, we didn't go into a job being disgruntled. Chances are.
Yep.
We got that way because lack of being heard and listened to.
Yep. I think that's really important. So we're getting down to about 8 minutes left, and I've got 9 questions sitting in front of me. Some of them are just comments, but I want to try to get through as many of them as possible. So we've got I'm just gonna kind of go through them, and to the extent we can answer them, we will. Not sure if anybody knows what the OSHA PEL for 2.5 PM particulate or total VOCs is. Emily, you've got
It should be easy to find.
Jeopardy.
Right, I mean, yes, you can certainly Google that, but I know that the air quality is considered safe if it is below 12 micrograms per meters cubed, and anything over 35 micrograms per meters cubed of PM 2.5 specifically is unsafe air quality in a 24-hour period. So that's not looking at, like, I don't know that is considered the time weighted average worker health exposure limit, but that is, if you're just looking at like good versus bad air quality, those are the levels for PM 2.5.
Thank God we have a geek on the line here.
Right.
When it comes to VOCs, like I mentioned, there are no thresholds that exist for cannabis per se, but the turpentine that NEOSH is using as their exceedance threshold levels to understand that has those 5 common terpenes to cannabis, that's 100 ppm.
Awesome. That's really helpful. Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm sure one of us could Google it and find the answer. It probably exists somewhere, but I'm glad. Yeah, thanks for having that, Emily, at the ready. Relatedly, there was another good question that came up from Nicholas here. Has anybody done a case study? Are we aware of anybody that's done a case study on different cannabis environments that test for things like this? TVOCs, CO2. Yeah.
So my company does that. I'm gonna put my hand down. My company offers those services with our R&D division. We can certainly do assessments, emissions assessments, and we do that for cannabis. So it's not so far it's not been a study we can just put out publicly because it's unfortunately client work. And not all clients are super open to, like, yeah, let's share these levels with the world, and even a redacted report. I mean, we're working actually on some right now that will likely turn into redacted versions online, and I will happily share those. We definitely encourage that because we understand there's a need for the case studies out there. But again, like, we work for clients, we have to be mindful of the MNDAs that have been signed, et cetera. So there's more to come there, but there is a reason why they don't exist readily, and it's because people are scared.
Yeah, which I hate that reality. I know there's a lot of research even on the vape pen, compatibility issue, which I'm a little bit more closely working with, and there's research going on, but folks are scared of what the results are going to be. That's not a reason to not share it, but we have to figure out a way to, get that out there, and at the very least use the results of that data to inform us to develop those standards, those best practices, through ASTM and other outlets where we really have the opportunity to write the playbook that the industry can benchmark against before the next state comes up with the newest regulation because of a knee-jerk reaction that we see so often. That's, again, typical to humans, not just calling out regulators, but that's what happens. So by doing this work, collecting the data, we can solve some of these problems. And so I'll make sure, Emily, you and Nicholas get connected afterwards too, because I appreciate some of these comments. What else do we have here? We've got, things about, like, are you seeing no PPE being offered by the employer, or lack of education of the employee as to what they need to keep themselves safe?
I can chime in real quick on this. I have talked to people who worked in facilities, and they've talked about reusing PPE, dirty PPE. So I'm sure there's situations where there's inadequate or no PPE being used, but again, kind of going back to our hierarchy, that's the last thing you want to resort to, right? So that education up front is important, but it doesn't start with the worker. It actually starts with the people running the operations, because what we do see is they may have SOPs for various operations. They may have a hazardous communications plan. They may have a respirator, program, but they don't necessarily have somebody assigned that's responsible for that program. It might be kind of out there and it's kind of floating around, and maybe somebody's keeping an eye on it, but there isn't a person that's responsible for that SOP, for that area of operation. And so that's a frequent observation and our assessments of they have a lot of the paperwork, they have a lot of the documents, the plans, they're doing a lot of things right, but they might not have it fully set up in a way that there's accountability and then ongoing training around that process.
Yeah, does that, Emily, I don't know if you have anything to add there in terms of the PPE question?
It's not so much a PPE, but the funny thing, I actually saw a recent article. It's not PPE. It is more of like hair nets, being worn to protect the consumer, right? You don't want to smoke or, hair. But there was a picture recently. It was a public article, new grow. The guy's wearing a hairnet and has a giant beard with no net. I just thought that was funny. I was like, the irony.
Oh my gosh.
We won't get his head hair, but we'll get his beard hair. That's great.
Right. So just with the few minutes we've got remaining, I want to try to at least get one more question out there. And I'm going to try to summarize a couple of things. One, there was a question about like mitigation corruption within the safety net between cannabis and public service government entities, thinking about, hey, I get to know, build a strong relationship and they're going to give you a heads up before they come in, which really minimizes, say, the, the risk of being compliant because you've got that advance notice. And I know in my world of third-party certification audits that I've, got a lot of experience too, there is that pro and con of being transparent with an announced visit versus the unannounced visits. And saying, you should be audit ready every day. That's a culture that you should maintain. The reality is that just, it's that little kick in the butt to be a little extra more prepared. So even if you're just getting in the practice of preparing for an audit, I think there's value there. But I recognize that corruption can kind of tweak, sneak in. And that relates to a question from Oklahoma where, there's no regulations there. I've been there. I've spoken to the Health and Human Services Senate there. Most owners don't even have insurance. What do you see happening on the regulatory front in Oklahoma? I guess I'd like to try to, and then there's another point about rural areas where you have smaller selection of educated and goal-oriented workers versus say, a more urban area where you've got more educated workforce that may have, a different set of culture and a different set of values and even knowledge of what the risks are wearing PPE, I guess. I were to bundle that all into one kind of question to get feedback on as we wrap up here. How do you address the cultural issues between, say, urban versus rural environments, and does that create different risks or considerations of the cannabis business? I don't know. Take that in my questions. I don't know if anybody has an answer there or thought.
I mean, I have something to say there. So yeah, I definitely environmental justice, the initiative in New Jersey, for example, I think that was a new law that came out last year. I want to say in 2022. Where they're actually really taking that.
I think it came out in 21 and 21? The regulations came out last year.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But so Jack, you can probably speak more to this, but that is just an example of a state that's looking at that specifically, urban versus rural areas, and who's being impacted, what groups of people are more impacted than others, and why is that? And that's looking at the history of zoning in certain areas, gentrification. Is it okay to just slap your business up in a warehouse in this area and not care about your emissions because you're an industrial park where there's people that live near those industrial parks and they're being impacted unequally. Yeah. So that is absolutely a risk that needs to be considered.
Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know that there's that kind of imbalance, but I think it probably could be occurring anywhere, whether it be rural or urban, in terms of the education level of the people that are working. We know that's an issue in the industry, just the level of pay and, in the industry, but there's no excuse in the law, right, for not knowing. So it's just more of an obligation that then falls on the business owner and the management teams to have these practices in place that are training workers and educating them and letting them know that they have a voice, letting them know that there are that they have rights. This signage that should be up in workplaces, right?
Mhm.
Department of Labor, State Department of Labor signage that tells employees what their rights are. So it probably exists in a lot of different areas, but it doesn't excuse the business owner from complying with minimum regulations. We're talking about best practices. So, the owners themselves and the management of those operations need to take it upon themselves to educate themselves and find the resources. We mentioned some free resources at the beginning. There are tons of free resources, and that's one of the things we do. We're here to educate and support and bring expertise to the industry through NCRPS and our Risk Management Association. And we're trying to lift the entire industry up. And part of what we do is curate resources that are available. So they're out there, and they're not that hard to find if you connect with the right people.
Well said, Jack. Geez, I'm looking at the clock and realizing we've gone a few minutes over, and I could keep us going all night. I feel this was so much fun. I wish we had more time, but this was, I mean, we scratched the surface, I'd say, pretty well. So I really want to thank both of you guys for coming and joining. Some closing words as we wrap up here, and just a couple notes to the audience. We will, I've got 14 questions. We kind of answered half of them. So as part of our follow-up email in a few days, early next week, we'll give some recaps and some additional context in addressing some of the questions that we found here. A reminder to, and I'm putting the link in the chat, next month, our webinar will be on March 22nd, and we'll be diving into same kind of theme, but working, we've got a couple of great folks, a consultant and an operator, that's going to discuss some of the most common pitfalls we see in process, in the actual manufacturing process, and how that all relates to risks in the business and how those could be avoided with simple proactive steps. So I'm really looking forward to that. As we wrap up though, just want to give Emily and Jack a last plug to share any key takeaways, how to contact you, or if there's one thing you want to get across to the audience before we go. Emily, I'll let you go first, and then we'll have Jack wrap us up.
I guess I don't be caught with your pants down kind of thing. If it's, a lot of times operators, it's a money issue. And so I didn't get a chance to touch on it earlier, but for those consultants out there, whoever you are, attorneys, etc., operators, the CapEx, pass this information along. When you're raising capital for your operation, you need to consider these risks that we're talking about: indoor air quality, properly engineered controls. That is the time to consider them. Don't let it be an afterthought, and then you have to go back to the money, the watering hole. They're not going to be happy with that. They're probably not going to give you the money, and so it just becomes like this rolling problem, and bigger risk as you continue to be in operation for the time being. So yeah, that's the time to get is the funding stage, is really to start taking these risks seriously, because obviously you need the money, and I understand that with cannabis, it's not easy to come by that funding. So that's the time. Yeah.
Well said, Emily. And that ties back to pay me now or pay me later, right? Raise that money, build that into your CapEx costs and investment, or struggle to survive and address it reactively later.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome, Emily. Thank you. Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't going to add anything, but just you brought up money. I'm sure there are people that are listening are going to see this in replay and hear this and think about, well, all these things cost money to do these things, but really encourage people to think about the cost of not doing them, right? Like if you have to clear out your grow operation, it's disinfected and restart everything, how much does that cost you? How much does the
rad machines,
the money you're spending on employee turnover and rehiring people, how much does that cost you? So think about the cost you're already bleeding because you're not following best practices, you're not instituting these programs as well as you could, and know that you could do better. Think of the cost that you're spending now that you could be reducing. And then the only other thing I was going to say is, I have a gift for you guys. So we'll be sending out as follow-up to this for everybody who attended access to one of the courses in the National Cannabis Risk Management Academy. Our Risk Management 101 class will be made available to you guys. So hopefully that'll get you intrigued enough to want to learn more.
That's awesome. I really appreciate you bringing that up earlier today and being like, hey, we've got something to offer. So I think let's go back to the education that we talked about and the resources. One more resource available for free that's normally not available for free. So yeah, a sincere thank you to you, Jack, and NCRMA and NCPRS for your time. Emily, this is like 3 months in the making, so I am super appreciative of you suggesting this idea and then coming on. This is so much fun. We've got a lot more to do, guys, together. So I'll see you all soon, and attendees, thanks for joining. Talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, David. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you so much, guys.
Cheers. Bye, everybody.